This episode was recorded with an audience of Ambition Empower members. Empower is a continuous learning program that rethinks how you learn new topics within the field of design. Instead of attending a conference, you attend Ambition Empower and take part in one or several tracks taught every week by industry design leaders. For more information, visit uxpodcast.com/empower.
UX Podcast Episode 307.
Hello, I'm Pat Axbom.
And I'm James Roy Lawson.
And this is UX Podcast. We're in Stockholm, Sweden, and you're listening to us all over the world from Spain to Ethiopia.
As a researcher, strategist, and UX designer, Alice Schmidt has worked both for agencies and in the public sector. Her greatest interest lies in the wicked problems inherent in enterprise design and the mysterious ways of large systems.
These are all areas she has delved into as product strategist for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. She also has a background as an award-winning reporter and producer for NPR and others, covering arts, business, technology, and urban development.
When technology moves so fast that regulation can't keep up, people's lives and livelihoods are put in jeopardy. Designers and engineers often react by creating ad hoc policies that might lead to even bigger problems.
Alexandra's new book, Deliberate Intervention, aims to show both designers and policymakers how to work together proactively to create tools and rules that truly serve the public interest.
And I should say that my views do not represent the views of the Federal Reserve.
When technology moves so fast that regulation can't keep up, people's lives and livelihoods are put in jeopardy. Designers and engineers often react by creating ad hoc policies that might lead to even bigger problems. Alexandra's new book, Deliberate Intervention, aims to show both designers and policymakers how to work together proactively to create tools and rules that truly serve the public interest.
So, Alex, they say honesty is the best policy. But what then is policy? Is it possible for us to pin down what we mean when we use the word policy within the digital design and tech space?
Well, I think policy in the digital design and tech space and policy in society means similar things. Governmental policy, you could say, which is simply shaping things to produce a world or a result that you are happy with. That's really all it is. You can break it down further into details, but that's what it comes down to. And in digital policy, that's what they're trying to do. And the same goes for government policy.
That's such a great way of not defining it, but really expressing the goal of it. I love that.
Thank you.
So how did your background in radio and you had a really interesting master's degree that you'd done as well with what was that? There was I've forgotten the name exactly. You'll know the name better than me.
Oh yeah, I did a master's in
cultural
journalism.
Reporting and criticism. There we go.
Yes. Yeah, it's been quite a journey to get to the point that I'm at right now. But I think that there's a lot. So I had this background as a journalist. And I think there's a lot of overlaps between journalism and UX. I actually wrote an article about that a little while back. I still interview people a lot, right? I interviewed people as a journalist. I interview people as a UX person. A lot of my work in UX is selling ideas. And that is something that's very similar to what I did as a journalist. Wrapping things up with a bow and presenting it, that's very similar, UX and journalism. So there's being curious, major overlap. So there's a lot of areas of overlap. And in some ways, it was a very natural transition that I made. Yeah. But the criticism piece, I think that comes through in this book that I wrote. I know we haven't touched on that, or maybe we did a little bit, but the criticism piece is really just kind of taking a little bit of an unconventional view on things and pushing back on the prevailing narrative. And I think that's kind of what I did in the book a little bit.
Because you yourself in the beginning of the book, you out yourself as a now what's the phrase you use there? It's
technophobe.
Technophobe, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is nice that you kind of put that straight out there at the very beginning of the book.
Mm-hmm.
But is that I guess that's connected to the criticism angle that you're talking about.
Absolutely. I think that it's great that a lot of people who work in the tech world are sort of cheerleaders and interested and excited about it. And I just don't come from that angle, right? I just come from a more doubtful, skeptical place, I suppose. And I think we need both. We need all of that. We need, the excited cheerleaders, and we need the people who kind of take a step back, and they're both important points of view.
So one narrative that a lot of companies within the tech industry have, obviously, is that they are going to save the world. And what you start off saying is design can't save the world. You're not saying it won't. You're not even saying it can't save the world. Talk to us a bit about that.
Yes, another one of my kind of unconventional pushback on the prevailing narrative stances. But, I think that perspective really comes from understanding the points of view of designers, where I think a lot of folks in the design world have a bit of a savior complex, where, they take a lot of the problems on their shoulders. We take a lot of problems on our shoulders. We're told we are the advocates for the user, and we are going to help people, and we are going to solve their problems. And we can't do that. And it shouldn't only be our job. And we actually have systems and institutions in society that it is their job. And so to your point of, companies saying they're going to save the world, well, how does the public sector interact with those private companies that have, in some cases, laudable goals? But we all have to shape things together, right? Public sector and private sector, design and policy. That's what the book is about.
I'm going to kind of stick up for the for UX designers for a moment and say I can imagine that we've got listeners out there that are saying, but I feel I can make a difference as an individual designer. What do you? I mean, is that something you don't want to crush that spirit? I guess.
No, not at all. And I actually, in the book, there's an entire chapter on, the book is about how do harms emerge from technologies, and then how do we react to that. And there's an entire chapter of the book on internal interventions. In other words, what can companies do inside to react to harms that emerge from technologies? And then there's another chapter, which is, when policy comes into play, external facing policy. And so, no, absolutely. I think that design has a major role to play, but up to a point, so you can't do everything, but there are things you can do. There's really important things you can do. And I can get into some of those, but yes, not trying to crush anybody's spirit. And I think that, also, I think it's empowering probably maybe for design to understand how, it interplays with these wider systems of policy. And that's kind of what I was trying to think about when I wrote the book. Maybe it even gives people new frames for thinking about how they can help and new ideas.
Yeah, because it's you as an individual, you are part of that bigger system, and you'll be working. I guess you're working within your organization, which in itself it has to follow policy regulations that come from outside the organization.
Yes, that's true. That's right.
And speaking to what the book covers, I mean, harm, because when people are actually intending to do good and save the world and having want to have all this impact and are being really careful designers and realize in the end that even though they take all this care, harm happens, something goes wrong. And how do you even reconcile with that? How do you acknowledge it as a designer, and how do you go about addressing it?
I think maybe the first thing to realize is that it's quite natural. And, I have a whole chapter about technologies throughout history and how harms emerged from them. And, every system creates a sort of unintended consequence. That's just the way of the world. And there's no way to reduce all of the side effects of what we design and our technologies. And so understanding that is something that's going to happen, and then from that frame of reference coming into, well, how can I make it as least harmful as possible when those harms start to emerge, and react to that? That is sort of the question that's at the core of the book.
Something that I really love that you talk about is how pain points and harm are different things. Because sometimes people will say, when we talk about ethics, well, that's my job. I work with pain points. I can do customer journeys. I find the pain points and I resolve them, so I eliminate harm. Whereas you really get into how, sure, pain points can be addressable by design interventions, but perhaps harm cannot. Yes,
thank you for saying that maybe better than I did, I think. That was like a very good crystallization of those ideas. So as designers, we look, at the detailed journey of a user, try to identify the pain points, the points of friction. But harms aren't usually something that users identify in the course of research. For two reasons. One is they accrue to society on a broader level, not necessarily to individuals, and they also become apparent later on in time. They're not something that a user is going to say, that's harmful to me. Come on, think about it. Like my example of that I use a couple times in the book, one of them is the YouTube algorithm, right? So, it's feeding me more and more sensational videos, and I like those. I perceive that as exciting and something that literally brings me delight as a user. But again, the harms accrue later on in time, and they accrue at a broader level of society. So you're not going to identify harms in the course of standard design research. That's just not how our work works.
And I guess as well that even if you do stumble across some of the harms, then I think we've all been part of that situation where it's dismissed as an edge case, or as it's something that's not affecting the bulk, so we don't need to worry about it.
I'd love to hear more about that, actually. Maybe I should have interviewed you for the book.
No, well, I think it does come up when you're not. Well, I say harm. You do come across things that maybe you don't want to fully design something because it can feel like an effort to cater for a particular situation or a particular group of people, and for them it might be quite harmful. It might exclude them, or a lot of the time we've had this issue around accessibility, for example, that you maybe have kickback, pushback from an organization to bother making something accessible because they don't see the people with accessibility needs as part of their core audience or primary audience, or want to prioritize dealing with it.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the when you talked before about we don't want to crush the spirit of design, there are things design can do. I think one of the big things that design can do is for proactive mitigation of harm is target designs to those most likely to be harmed, right? And this is something I talk about in the book. What happens is when you target designs to those most likely to be harmed is that benefits accrue to a much wider group of people. I'm sure you know this. Or you've heard these ideas before. One of the examples that we have, I don't know if this is the case in Stockholm or Sweden or other parts of the world, but we have things called curb cuts that, they're on some sidewalks and not others, and they let you kind of roll. And sidewalks were not always designed with curb cuts. They had to retrofit the sidewalks of cities in order to accommodate for originally wheelchairs, right? So people who couldn't walk. And what ended up happening is that a lot of other people benefited. People who were pushing babies in strollers. And, there were, perhaps people who just were on crutches or just had a pain in their knee or whatever it is, So the point is that, even though it might seem like a very small number of people who are being harmed by something, there's a much wider group that benefits from addressing those harms.
Yeah. So the gathering, so the summation of knowledge or observations of that greater benefit for society, that's not going to come from the individual organization. That's going to have to come from a bigger part of the system.
That's right. And in fact, here we have the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was a landmark piece of regulation policy that caused our cities and institutions to have, handicapped stalls in bathrooms and tons of, it had a million design implications for our built environment. And it didn't come from the original, exactly. It didn't come from the private companies that were building, our infrastructure. It had to be something that came down from on high, and was sort of dictated to society. You must do this, right? So, I think the point that you're making, which I think is my point in the book, is that, you can't necessarily expect individual designers within a capitalist ecosystem to address all of this. It's just probably not going to happen in all cases, as hard as you might try. And our society writ large has to come in and address these things.
This makes me think about what I've started now calling the dance of policy creation. I don't even think you call it a dance, but when I was reading that chapter, it was more like, so it's both proactive and reactive. So something happens, technology is introduced into society, society reacts, and then it reshapes the technology itself, and then the policies have to change. So there's always something going on. So just with the accessibility example, like having a ramp for wheelchairs, yes, I have a ramp for wheelchairs. Okay, so it turns out it's too steep, so people can't actually get up. So we have to change the policy. How does that happen in a space where everything is moving so fast?
Yeah, you mean like in digital tech?
Yeah.
That is a great question. I think that's something that we're struggling with right now. And, there's this idea of like the pacing problem, that I mentioned in the book, which is basically that technology moves really fast and policy moves really slow. So they're operating at different paces. And how do we bring those things closer together? And, there's a chapter in the book about bringing policy and design closer together. And I think that there's a lot of interesting movement in that space. So, for example, you could be a designer who gets interested in policy and how your work interacts with it. There's somebody who I interviewed who works on healthcare UX, and he's super involved and aware of policy and has opinions on it and actually tries to impact it. So I think that, there is a place for designers to kind of reach up, if you want to think of it that way, and connect with the policy sphere. And there's lots of other examples of these spheres coming closer together. But I think that that's, the nascent idea of how maybe we start to address this problem.
So I think in the book you mention, like Pers brought up as well, the reactive and policy is reactive rather than proactive, and you suggest that we need to be more thoughtful and collaborative. So I'm getting the understanding now that when you say collaborative, you mean with the policymakers themselves. In some cases, yes, right? So right.
Convening policymakers and everybody who's part of the work of shaping technology is one of the things that can happen and does happen in some spaces. And in other spaces, it really doesn't. We have, an agency will issue an intent of, this is in the US, right? This book does not cover the policy making of the entire world. So it is US centric, I'm sorry, but I had to focus in one place.
But I do like the fact that you point that out at the beginning of the book.
Yes.
That was nice to see that you actually put it out there that, yep, I know this is UX-centric, but there'll be useful stuff for you in the rest of the world as well. It's nice to see.
Exactly. There was no way to kind of, at least in the time that I had, to cover all of the policymaking apparatuses in the world. But, there are some patterns that are going to hold true no matter what country you're in. But we have that agencies issue like an intent of rulemaking. We're going to, we intend to make a rule, and then companies read this, essay online and they write back a letter and they sort of go back and forth. And then it's like, a thing gets created. So that's a very, not modern way of collaborating, right? You can think we have workshops, we have methods of talking, we have to discuss things. There's a whole piece in the book where I talk about facilitation and collaborative policymaking. That's something that doesn't happen as much right now. And I think there could be more of that. It is complicated, right? Because there's so many different parties that you need to bring to the table. I'm sure you've had, the challenge of scheduling a workshop where you need lots of different people, and you need them all there, or else you're not going to get, the right solution. So I think that that's one of the challenges of doing this well, is bringing everybody to the table, and having those types of conversations. But that's one of the things that I think is an opportunity space.
So where's the line then between collaboration and lobbying?
Well, I guess when I think of lobbying, I think of, coming in and saying, I want, I think, first of all, a lobbyist is like somebody who's paid by a company to get a certain policy outcome. And when I think of designers collaborating with policymakers, I don't think of the designers. Maybe I'm putting the superhero.
The reason why this question popped into my head, I was just thinking about, going back to the individual designer and kind of that power as an individual designer and the enthusiasm. And then if you're in an organization, then, bubbling that up, you're going to reach organizational level. And then that made me think of, especially in America, then once you get to organizational levels, there's an awful lot of lobbying goes on where the organization pushes for a certain policy. So I just kind of started to wonder about where that, multi-layered approach or system, where do we, is there anything we can look out for to see when we're, moving across into lobbying and we aren't maybe pushing policy, our ideal policy anymore?
No, you're right. I mean, I think that that's a really, really interesting perspective. And I guess what I would say is that, we're dealing with like giant, in some cases, institutions and organizations where, people doing lobbying are like in a completely different space from, somebody who's, saying I'm working with, whoever's writing this policy and I'm working with the UX of fill in the blank. And, it's like completely, you might not even be aware that there's lobbying happening because you're in a completely different part of the organization. Sometimes the left hand doesn't speak to the right. That's not a great thing, but my point is that these things don't necessarily need to be impacted by each other. They can happen in separate spheres.
I feel like you're opening a door for people who are struggling within their own companies, perhaps, to make a difference and raise their hand and say, this isn't working for me and I see all these dangers, where they can actually put that energy into perhaps, I'll call it activism, to actually influence policy. And go in that direction instead, and perhaps have a more sustainable impact.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm going for here. I mean, I just think, what we've been doing hasn't exactly been working, and I'm trying to find other approaches. I think one of the things that a lot of folks are talking about right now are sort of like ethical toolkits and using ethics in design. I think that's, a sort of trend or wave that we're seeing right now. And I think it's laudable and important. But again, I come back to this idea of that has limits. You're still in a capitalist paradigm, and you're not going to be able to escape that, even with all the ethics that you bring to the table. And so this is exactly what I'm trying to do. Thank you for putting it that way. What are other things that you can do to try to be the most positive force within technology that you can be? And this is why I wanted to look at this policy lens.
So what should I do as a designer tomorrow to support the idea of creating a policy to safeguard people who are impacted by my industry?
Well, so, I mean, this is something that I struggled with on this book because my editor and publisher, they really wanted it to be a to-do. How to, right? And I was always pushing back and I was saying, this book is not a how-to. This book is not a how-to. This book is how to think. And I always thought that how to think is sort of the first step in this extremely dense space, and the how to think is the how-to. So, I'm going to push back a little bit on the what do I do next question. I think immersing oneself in these ideas and starting to ponder them more deeply is the first step. At the end of the book, I do have a list of things that you can try. One of them is like facilitation, getting to know policy, getting curious about it, understanding how it's being shaped in your space. That's an awesome first step. But again, the book is not a how-to, it's a how to think. And I'm trying to stay away from too many prescriptive solutions.
Changing mindsets rather than providing
Yes.
the toolkit. Yeah.
Exactly. I'm not ready to be like, check, you have a checklist now, you're done. That's not what I'm going for here.
You are now a certified policymaker.
Exactly. Yeah, that's not what this is about.
I think that was a perfect note to end on.
Thank you. That was really fun.
Thank you so much, Alex.
So the thing that just keeps coming back to me, or I suppose nagging me when it comes to policy and listening back to the interview with Alex, is this whole thing where we have the boundless internet, this global thing that we created, trying to be harnessed by bounded policy, by policies that are framed within the context of a country. Alex herself, I gave a praise in the interview about how her book opens up by being very forthright and open about the fact that she has limited the scope to the USA when it comes to particular policy details, which is excellent that she says that up front. But at the same time, it's kind of, I suppose it reveals the whole problematic nature of this area, that you have to deal in a legal framework, and that legal framework of policy is within a country or a region in some aspects. If you're looking at the EU, I guess, or in America, I guess it's state level and then federal level. But you've, at the end of the day, you've got machines that are connected to each other globally.
Right. So as a country, you can regulate within your own borders, but the corporations and the internet companies, they work globally. So they actually have to comply with all the laws of all the countries.
Ultimately, that's what we're talking about. When if you're offering a global service, then you have got to apply, comply to everything.
Right. And so when we hear people say, like the billionaires say that, well, the cost of doing business is being sued and fined for breaking the law, we sort of, that feels awful. But at the same time, thinking about how many laws and policies you actually have to know and understand, it's quite hard to comply with them all.
It is. And I guess so what you end up with as a natural state, I guess, for organizations is a little bit of one of, well, fear or ignorance or both. That, when you've met with a policy sphere and say, okay, can we comply to this policy sphere in another region? And if the answer is kind of, well, I don't think so, then you're naturally going to close the door to it. And in internet terms, that means not making your product or service available in a certain territory.
Right. So you essentially you put up a geographical wall for your service.
Yeah, that becomes the legal requirement, effectively, if you're not prepared to meet policy in that other region. And we've seen this, I mean, since GDPR came on board here in Europe, that especially medical websites, American medical websites, most of those, Healthline is a prime example there. When we Google for things, and a Healthline result comes up in the search results, you click on it and you're met by a cookie banner. It basically asks to give your consent for loads and loads of cookies. Fair enough, that's them trying to comply with various policy and law. And if you say no thank you, then you basically get told you're not allowed to view the content.
Yeah.
And there are some sites even where it doesn't even give you the choice. You just can't view the content because you're in Europe.
Yeah, I'm surprised by the number of news sites actually that have this thing saying that you're visiting from the EU, so you're not allowed to view our content.
And I'm just presuming this is where policy. Someone has explored policy in other regions, and they've gone, the legal team, whatever, gone, look, we're not living up to this, so you need to do something. And then someone's gone, whoa, that's really complicated and expensive for us to do, and maybe even clashes completely with our business model. We'll just shut the door quietly and leave.
Yeah.
And that goes against, or at least, I suppose, for some of us, the hope and dream of the internet was something global and unifying.
Exactly. That's sort of the point. And I mean that's why Web3 is growing, and the whole idea of decentralization. And of course, it's all in conflict with each other. It's in conflict with the idea of having localized laws, really.
Yeah, Which, yeah, I mean, of course it is, because it's global.
Yeah.
And then so we're back to the whole, I guess, one of the main points of Alex's book and the work that, I mean, policy goes slow, and
Yeah.
technology goes fast, and people can get harmed, and what can you do to stop people from getting harmed? Yeah.
For me, there's also the power imbalance of these huge companies having more money than some of the countries they're active in, which means how could you possibly have any power over a company that's so much richer than even your own country?
Yeah, I think an example there would be like, if you take Iceland, for example. I mean, it's what, 300,000 people.
Yeah.
You know,
I think that's a
I
perfect
mean, its
example.
GDP is nowhere near many of these large organisations that are heading up both the policy debate and the policy problem, I guess. So all they can do, Iceland, I guess, is just tag along.
Yeah.
You know, ultimately, I mean, maybe they can try and influence. I mean, maybe that's the question. You know, how do you, in that kind of situation, exert an impact and try and kind of shape things? Because you are on the back foot as a small nation.
Exactly. I mean, it does come down to activism, really. I mean, that's your power to protest, to make people aware.
Yeah, I mean, I brought up in the interview that distinction of where does collaboration and trying to work together with those creating policy, dealing with policy, when does that end and lobbying start? You know, example would be if you're working for like Google, and as part of your job at Google, you are meeting with policymakers, people who are working within the policy world, and giving them your advice. Who's checking to make sure your advice is genuine, neutral advice, rather than what Google wants you to say as part of your role when meeting those policymakers?
I mean, which you would have to assume the latter, I guess. And then that makes me think of the policymakers then, of course, applying for jobs within these companies. So how does that lead to any sort of trust at all? I think was it Nick Clegg that you mentioned?
Yeah,
so
when
you went to Facebook.
The UK, Nick Clegg was part of the government, David Cameron's government, a little while ago now, and after finishing up in government, when they lost the subsequent election, he then signed up to be part of Facebook's. He was working for Facebook in this particular area of policy, and yeah, so you wonder kind of like, you know, how does that work? I mean, can you? There's so many ways it could be. You could manipulate those situations and end up creating something that's not genuine.
So it does come down to power and whose voice matters and who gets heard and who understands what is going on. I mean, that's a huge aspect of it. Who understands?
Excellent point. I mean, in the digital world, we've seen time and time again that politicians and policymakers really don't understand what they're dealing with and what they're talking about, and the speed at which policy moves means that by the time they've even started to maybe understand it, we've moved on.
Yeah.
So you end up something getting more regulated, or policies being set for something which actually isn't really relevant anymore, and we're kind of like 3 steps beyond that already.
So that makes it even harder for people, even with activism, to help make people aware of the issues, because I think you need people to understand, the larger majority of people to understand something for them to be able to push lawmakers and policymakers to making a change.
The last chapter of Alex's book, conclusion, is we mentioned it a bit in the interview, the to-do list, the concrete advice of what you can do, and a lot of it is, of course, around being more aware of and having more conversations around when you could be causing harm, and staying on top of both design and policy, and building bridges, making sure you try and move things upstream. It's facilitate and collaborate, and that made me start thinking about maybe we need to have more education for policymakers. As in, we need to not just collaborate with them, but actually design, UX for policymakers or whatever, or technology for policymakers.
Yeah.
Really kind of lift their understanding of not necessarily the details, just the space, and the messy world that we're in, because it's global.
It's a good point. I mean, I think some policymakers actually do a good job of that, and actually do make certain that they do study up on whatever they're deciding on. But of course, there's a huge gap there.
And sometimes politics,
and the gap never
yeah,
stops.
sometimes politics forces policy to move at a different speed to what the policy makers would like.
Exactly.
We might not be ready yet, but yet a particular political situation means that you have to be ready. This needs to go in now because we've got a window of doing it now. Or the people demand it. Demand it
That's
now.
the thing, isn't it? There's the window is always there. The window where you have power, which puts so many constraints on the whole idea of policymaking.
And we still haven't solved the international aspect.
Still, to end on a positive note, I mean, for me, since I'm a person who's been very engaged and truly working with digital ethics for a while now, her points about educating people, as you're saying, making people more aware, engaging in activism towards policymaking is something that is, I feel like, yes, that's a really good next step or a good complement to the work I'm doing now.
Yeah, and I think we can be more, those times when we kind of, notice something and maybe push back a bit and say, look, we shouldn't be doing this. Then I'd like us to be more vocal about those moments we do it.
Yes.
Because that communication will raise awareness and normalize some of the good behavior in some of these areas, which backs up some of Alex's points that we can, we can be ahead of the curve. We can avoid things by happening. The more we talk about some of the things that we didn't do, we make it more likely, I guess, that other organizations won't do it either.
Exactly. Good one. I'm now looking at recommended listening. It's always you who puts these together, so I'm always curious myself. So, what has James recommended this time? And I'm seeing, is it episode 92?
Yeah.
Wow, that's a long time ago. Managing Chaos with Lisa Welchman. Love that one.
That was our first chat with Lisa.
Yeah.
Around the time she released her book about digital governance. So here I've pulled in an episode which links in with governance, because policy and governance they're not the same, but they're bedfellows.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So that seemed really relevant listening. It's always relevant to listen to Lisa.
It is. Remember to keep moving.
See you on the other side.
Did you know, James, I'm like the fabric version of King Midas.
You're like the fabric version of King Midas.
Everything I touch becomes felt.
Oh,